It was a morning heavy with expectation, a day when the air itself seemed to vibrate with mystery. Crowds pressed together on the hillsides, waiting not for a political proclamation, nor a military order, but for words. Words from a man who refused to speak like the rulers of the age. Instead of decrees or commands, Jesus opened his mouth and told stories of farmers casting seeds, of sheep lost in the wilderness, of fields where wheat and weeds struggled side by side. To the casual ear, these were simply pastoral images. But to the searching soul, they were codes, metaphors, concealing truths that could not be handed out cheaply to an unprepared crowd. This strategy was deliberate. The Roman Empire ruled through fear, spectacle, and force. Religious authorities controlled through ritual, tradition, and rigid law. Jesus chose neither. He chose parables layered, cryptic, demanding. Those who sought entertainment left puzzled. Those who sought transformation felt pierced. This was not just teaching, it was selective revelation. He himself drew a line. 2. You it is given to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. With these words, Jesus announced what could be described as a silent revolution, not fought with swords but with perception. Not everyone was ready to see. Not everyone was able to hear. His stories became a veil. For the indifferent, they concealed. For the prepared, they revealed. And so every parable became a test. Would the listener remain at the surface, or would they risk diving deeper? Modern scholars of communication note how power often hides in narrative. Governments, corporations, even global institutions deploy metaphors to frame reality, to guide mass perception. Jesus anticipated this but inverted it. He didn't manipulate through stories, he protected truth through them. Just as today, classified intelligence cannot be released until the recipient is trusted, divine mysteries could not be scattered carelessly. Truth, he implied, was sacred. It required maturity. It demanded readiness. The kingdom he proclaimed was not the kingdom Rome patrolled with legions, nor the one Jewish rebels dreamed of retaking with zeal. It was something both invisible and more dangerous. The kingdom of God is within you, he declared, words that still echo as a challenge to external authority. If the kingdom is internal, then no empire can conquer it, no priest can monopolize it, and no institution can fully contain it. And so Jesus reserved the deeper explanations for his closest disciples. Away from the crowds, in olive groves, in fishing boats drifting just beyond the shoreline, he explained what the stories truly meant. He who has ears to hear, let him hear. The same teaching that baffled the crowd was illumination to a few. It was not about intellectual brilliance, it was about willingness. As intelligence agencies classify need to know, so too did Jesus operate under spiritual need to know. Access was determined not by privilege but by readiness. The Roman world understood secrecy well. The imperial cult used hidden rituals to preserve power. Mystery religions in Alexandria and Athens spoke in symbols only initiates could decode. In this sense, Jesus' parables resonated with the age. But his purpose was not elitism, it was protection, not of power, but of purity. The sacred had to be guarded from mockery, from distortion, from those who would turn a living truth into lifeless dogma. Yet even here there was tension. The crowd longed for miracles, for bread, for spectacle. The disciples hungered for wisdom. Jesus gave both, but never confused the two. Bread satisfied the stomach. Truth awakened the spirit. One was temporary relief. The other was permanent transformation. And so while thousands ate from his hand, only a handful carried seeds that would one day change civilizations. To understand this paradox, one must see the parables not as children's tales, but as encrypted transmissions. They functioned like spiritual ciphers whose meaning unfolded only to those who approached with faith and humility. In today's terms, they were less like entertainment and more like classified briefings hidden in plain sight, but accessible only to those whose inner frequency was tuned. Each parable demanded participation. It was not a finished statement but an invitation. Just as democratic systems today require citizens to interpret policies and cast votes, The parables required the listener to lean in, wrestle, and engage. The truth was not spoon-fed. It was activated. But here lies the radical edge. The kingdom Jesus announced was a revolution of consciousness. It could not be mapped onto territory, signed into law, or enforced with armies. It was internal and thus unstoppable. Every empire in history has crumbled: Babylon, Rome, Byzantium, colonial empires. But the kingdom within has never been toppled. For this reason, parables were not just pedagogical tools, they were weapons of survival, ensuring the truth could outlast suppression. His closest disciples began to realize this. John, Peter, James, men with no institutional power, no aristocratic titles, were entrusted not because of favoritism, but because of readiness. They were willing to unlearn, to die to what they thought they knew. And this is perhaps the hardest lesson for any age, ancient or modern. The kingdom requires rebirth. Old frameworks collapse, dogmas dissolve, the ego resists, but the spirit is called forward. Even today, in a century dominated by technology, surveillance, and information wars, the parables remain relevant. They remind us that truth cannot always be transmitted directly. Sometimes it must be hidden, wrapped in story, protected from distortion, until hearts are ready. The kingdom, then, was not propaganda, not spectacle, not dogma. It was seed, quiet, fragile, demanding soil, and those who had ears to hear heard. Throughout the Gospels, we find Jesus withdrawing from the crowds. He climbed mountains, disappeared into deserts, sought silence in olive gardens. These moments were not simply escapes from exhaustion, they were strategy. In a world obsessed with spectacle, he chose seclusion. In an age when leaders built their credibility on public debate and loud display, he retreated into silence. Because silence, more than words, was the true theater of revelation. Think of the world around him. The Roman Senate thundered with speeches. Generals paraded with fanfare. Religious leaders read the law in crowded synagogues. Jesus instead created pockets of stillness. It was in these private intervals, when the noise of the crowd had died, that the highest truths emerged. He knew that real transformation could not occur in the echo chamber of public opinion. It required quiet, intimacy, the kind of attention that cannot be distracted by applause or resistance. The disciples themselves struggled with this. They often fell asleep in Gethsemane while Jesus begged them to watch and pray. The symbolism is clear. Even physical closeness does not guarantee spiritual presence. Attention must be cultivated. And attention, in his teaching, was born not of frantic activity but of silence. This is a pattern echoed across history. Mystics in every tradition, from Sufi poets in Persia to Buddhist monks in Tibet, recognize that silence is not emptiness but fullness. It is the space where the divine can be heard. The difference is that Jesus translated this ancient spiritual strategy into a revolutionary political act. To fall silent before Pilate, refusing to defend himself, was more than resignation, it was defiance, a refusal to play the empire's game of words and power. His silence spoke louder than eloquence, and this silence was contagious. Like the flame of one candle igniting another, his presence in stillness awakened consciousness in those near him. The Gospels record that sometimes people were more transformed by his gaze than by his sermons. The authority of this gaze did not come from rhetoric or military strength, but from alignment, inner unity between spirit and action. Today, analysts might compare it to soft power, the ability to influence not by coercion but by attraction. But even this falls short, for his power did not operate at the level of geopolitics but at the core of human identity. In one of the most mysterious events, the Transfiguration, Jesus ascended a mountain with only Peter, James, and John. There, without explanation, his body radiated light. Moses and Elijah appeared, and a voice thundered from heaven. No parable, no debate, just raw revelation. This was not content to be analyzed in the public square. It was an unveiling of reality beyond form, accessible only to those prepared to bear it. The mountain symbolized elevation of consciousness, a summit only reached when the baggage of the ego is shed. But even at that peak moment, silence was the medium. What happened could not be fully described, only experienced. For the modern observer, this carries a lesson. There are dimensions of truth that cannot be captured in headlines, doctrines, or even scientific formulas. They can only be lived. Another striking scene is in Gethsemane on the eve of betrayal. Jesus invites his disciples to keep watch, yet as he prays, they fall asleep. The contrast is brutal. The master surrenders in silence, bending to a higher will, while his closest followers are dulled by fatigue. It is a mirror for humanity itself. Even when truth is within reach, many remain unconscious. The challenge was not just for them, it remains for us. The call to stay awake is as urgent now as it was then. His conversation with Nicodemus also reveals why silence was necessary. Nicodemus, a learned Pharisee, sought Jesus by night, away from the scrutiny of others. In the safety of seclusion, Jesus explained the mystery of spiritual rebirth. The wind blows wherever it pleases. You hear its sound, but you cannot tell where it comes from or where it is going. So it is with everyone born of the Spirit. Such teaching would not survive in a noisy crowd. It required privacy, patience, and vulnerability. Silence, then, was not avoidance. It was pedagogy. By withholding, Jesus preserved. By concealing, he revealed. He understood that truth can be mutilated when exposed prematurely. Even modern politics echoes this principle. Treaties negotiated in secret rooms are often the ones that survive. In economics, long-term strategies are crafted quietly, away from the volatility of markets. Similarly, Jesus sowed truths in silence, allowing them to germinate in receptive hearts before being exposed to the winds of public opinion. This explains why he often commanded discretion after miracles. Tell no one. He knew the crowd was hungry for spectacle, but spectacle would only trivialize what was meant to be transformative. The kingdom was not theater, it was seed, and every seed requires darkness and silence to sprout. Perhaps no story illustrates this better than Mary and Martha. Martha busied herself with duties while Mary sat silently at the teacher's feet. Jesus praised Mary's choice as the better part. In a culture that prized action, service, and visible devotion, this was a radical inversion. Silence, contemplation, listening, these were crowned as higher than agitation, performance, or ritual. For centuries, religious and political institutions struggled with this message. Silence undermines systems built on noise decrees, laws, spectacles, propaganda. Yet silence also protects. It prevents truth from being reduced to ideology. That is why Jesus embraced it, wielded it like a weapon, and left it as a legacy. To those who could bear it, silence became a portal. Not the silence of passivity, but the silence of radical attention, a listening so deep that even the heartbeat of the divine could be felt. This silence was not absence, but presence, not emptiness, but fullness. And in that fullness the kingdom drew near. Among the most misunderstood words in the teachings of Jesus is metanoia. In most translations it appears as repentance, a term often flattened into moral regret or religious guilt. But in the language of the time, metanoia carried far greater weight. It meant a radical change of mind, a fundamental reorientation of perception, a complete renewal of consciousness. When Jesus proclaimed, "Repent, for the kingdom of heaven is near," he was not urging shallow remorse. He was calling for a seismic shift of awareness, an awakening so profound that it alters the way one sees reality itself. This transformation was not about external conformity. It was about internal revolution. Political systems of the age sought reform through laws, taxation, and armies. Religious elites demanded adherence to rituals, tithes, and purity codes. Jesus bypassed both. His revolution was inward. He offered a new operating system for the human spirit. The challenge was not to overthrow Caesar, nor to purify temple rituals, but to dismantle the illusions of the ego. Only then could the kingdom already within become visible. To illustrate this, Jesus used images of rebirth and renewal. New wine cannot be poured into old wineskins. One must be born again to see the kingdom. The old mind clings, competes, controls. The renewed mind trusts, surrenders, expands. In today's psychological language, it is the shift from fear-based cognition to compassion-centered awareness. In economic terms, it is the difference between zero-sum thinking and systems of shared abundance. Metanoia was and still is the threshold into a new reality. Nicodemus struggled with this. "How can a man be born when he is old?" he asked. Jesus responded enigmatically, "What is born of the flesh is flesh. What is born of the Spirit is spirit." Here lies the heart of metanoia. It is not a superficial behavioral change, but a recreation of identity. Those who undergo it cease to live merely as conditioned beings shaped by society and fear. They awaken to their essence eternal, luminous, free. This was not abstract mysticism, it was practical liberation. But liberation is never easy. Metanoia is disruptive. It threatens the ego, which resists annihilation. That is why Jesus described the way as narrow, why he spoke of dying to the old self. He was not advocating self-destruction, but ego dissolution. The cross itself became the ultimate symbol of this process, the place where illusion dies so that spirit might live. To lose one's life, in his language, was to shed the false identity and uncover the true. The prodigal son exemplifies this. He leaves home, squanders everything, and falls into ruin. But then the text says, he came to himself. That phrase is metanoia in action, not mere regret, but awakening. He remembers his origin, his father, his true home. His decision to return symbolizes the journey of consciousness, away from illusion, back into reality. The Father's embrace is the eternal acceptance waiting for all who awaken. Paul the Apostle later described this transformation in words that still reverberate. "It is no longer I who live, but Christ lives in me." Here metanoia reaches its climax, the merging of human consciousness with divine presence. The self is not erased, it is fulfilled. The ego falls silent, and the deeper identity shines. This idea resonates even beyond theology. In geopolitics, revolutions collapse when they only change regimes without altering mindsets. Empires rise and fall, but unless the collective consciousness shifts, oppression repeats. Metanoia suggests that true revolution begins within. A society of awakened individuals cannot be enslaved by propaganda or tyranny. This may be why Jesus' message alarmed both empire and temple. It undermined control at the root, and yet he insisted it was open to all. Metanoia was not the privilege of the educated or elite. Fishermen, tax collectors, prostitutes, all were invited. What mattered was willingness, courage to turn inward, faith to let go of old certainties. The Pharisees clung to law, the zealots to violence. But Jesus offered an alternative, the quiet revolution of consciousness. Still, the cost was high. The ego resists. It builds new masks even within religion itself. Many crave recognition as saints or masters, but this too is the ego disguised. Jesus warned against it. When you pray, go into your room, close the door, and pray to your Father in secret. The secret chamber is not just a physical space, but a state of inner solitude where the ego cannot perform. Only there can the true self emerge. In our own age, the idea of metanoia remains urgent. Humanity wrestles with crises of climate, economics, and war. Politicians offer reforms, corporations offer solutions. Yet without metanoia, a shift in perception from domination to stewardship, from competition to cooperation, these crises repeat. What Jesus proposed was not just personal salvation. It was the survival of civilization. A society blind to inner transformation is doomed to replay its cycles of collapse. The question he posed to Nicodemus echoes still. Can an old humanity be reborn? Can modern civilization undergo metanoia? Can the world awaken to the kingdom that is already here? The challenge is no less today than it was 2,000 years ago. The door remains narrow, the invitation remains urgent, and the kingdom waits not in the future, not in heaven, but within. Jesus often spoke of an inner battle, a struggle not fought with swords, but within the human heart. He called his followers to deny themselves, take up their cross, and even lose their life in order to find it. These phrases, frequently misunderstood, were not invitations to self-hatred but to self-discovery. They pointed to a conflict between two identities: the illusory self built by ego, fear, and attachment, and the true self rooted in spirit, freedom, and divine likeness. The ego seeks titles, recognition, applause. It thrives on comparison and competition. It is the self that lives for image, not essence. Jesus recognized this clearly in the Pharisees who prayed loudly in the streets or gave alms with great spectacle. He called them hypocrites not because they prayed or gave, but because they performed for appearance rather than truth. The ego, he taught, could never inherit the kingdom. By contrast, the true self is humble, silent, simple. It does not need to prove anything because its identity is secure in the divine source. To embrace this self was, for Jesus, the only way to access the kingdom. Whoever wants to save their life will lose it, but whoever loses their life for my sake will find it. This paradox revealed the essence of his message. Clinging to ego leads to emptiness. Surrendering the ego allows the eternal self to shine. This struggle was not theoretical. It played out vividly in the lives of his disciples. Peter, bold and loyal in words, denied Jesus 3 times when fear overwhelmed him. Here the ego was exposed, desperate to preserve itself at any cost. Yet after the resurrection, Peter emerged, transformed, willing to die for the message he once abandoned. His journey was proof that the inner battle could be won, and that even failure could become soil for transformation. In many ways, Jesus inverted the power structures of his time. While Rome glorified conquest and hierarchy, he declared, "Whoever wants to be first must be the servant of all." Greatness, he taught, was measured not in domination but in service. The throne of the kingdom was not external, but internal. And in this reversal, the ego's logic collapsed. Where empire demanded superiority, the kingdom demanded humility. Even his own disciples struggled with this inversion. They argued about who would be the greatest, expecting political thrones, but Jesus washed their feet, dramatizing the true order of greatness. In today's political analysis, this act was revolutionary. It dismantled the very foundation of hierarchical power by reframing leadership as service. In corporate terms, it was the ultimate rejection of the top-down model and introduction of what modern scholars might call servant leadership. The temptation narrative in the desert makes the inner battle universal. There, Jesus faced the 3 great lures of ego: survival without trust, bread; recognition without integrity, jumping from the temple; and power without surrender, ruling the kingdoms of the world. He rejected each. The desert was more than geography. It was the battlefield of consciousness, and his victory set the template. The ego must be denied, not pampered. The kingdom could never be built on its terms. For modern listeners, this battle remains deeply relevant. The ego today is magnified by technology. Social media thrives on comparison, applause, curated identities. Consumer economies train people to define themselves by what they own. Political systems reward those who dominate, not those who serve. In this environment, the call to deny the false self is more countercultural than ever. Yet it is precisely this counterculture that may hold the key to human survival. Consider geopolitics. Nations, like individuals, operate from ego or essence. Empires rise when fueled by domination and collapse when blinded by pride. The Soviet Union, the British Empire, Rome itself, each fell not only to external pressures but to internal illusions. Ego-driven systems cannot endure. Jesus' warning applies to civilizations. What does it profit a man to gain the whole world but lose his soul? What does it profit a nation to dominate economically and militarily yet collapse morally and spiritually. The battle between false and true selves scales from the individual to the collective. To deny oneself, then, is not nihilism. It is discernment. It is learning to separate the shell from the seed, the mask from the face. It is to refuse to live as a slave to image and instead awaken as a bearer of essence. Jesus described this essence as the image of God, incorruptible, eternal, beyond comparison. The ego may gain the world, but it perishes. The true self may lose everything, but it endures. This was the heartbeat of discipleship. Not rituals, not dogmas, but vigilance. Watch and pray, he urged, because the ego is cunning. It returns with new disguises, even in spiritual garb. Many who seek enlightenment end up addicted to recognition. Many who pursue justice fall prey to pride. The ego can infiltrate even holy work. Hence, the battle never ends. It must be fought daily, choice by choice, thought by thought. And yet, Jesus promised victory. He embodied it. He showed that when the false self dies, the true self rises with unshakable peace. This is not merely theology. It is psychology, politics, and survival. The ego imprisons. The true self liberates. The kingdom belongs only to the latter. In a decisive moment recorded in the Gospels, Jesus turned to his disciples and asked, "Who do people say that I am?" They answered cautiously. Some said John the Baptist, others Elijah, still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. But then, his eyes fixed on them and the question became personal. "And you, who do you say that I am?" Silence hung heavy. Then Peter, stirred not by logic but by revelation, declared, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." With this confession, something extraordinary unfolded. Jesus replied, "Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for this was not revealed to you by flesh and blood, but by my Father in heaven. And I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." The scene has fueled centuries of debate. Were these keys institutional power, the birth of the papacy, the foundation of religious hierarchy, or was something deeper at play? To understand, we must peel away layers of history and look at the moment itself. Peter was not rewarded for intellect nor for loyalty. Both would fail him soon enough. He was given the keys because for a brief instant he saw beyond appearances. He perceived truth not through tradition, but through direct revelation. That clarity piercing the veil of ego and culture was the real key. It was a moment when human consciousness opened to divine reality. The keys then were not physical nor political. They symbolized access. They represented the authority of awakened perception. When Jesus said, "What you bind on earth will be bound in heaven," he was describing alignment. When consciousness is united with the divine, human actions resonate beyond the temporal into the eternal. This was not power to dominate, but power to harmonize. Not control, but responsibility. Yet Peter's story reminds us that revelation is fragile. Just moments later, he tried to dissuade Jesus from the path of the cross. Jesus rebuked him harshly. "Get behind me, Satan. You do not have in mind the concerns of God, but merely human concerns." In a flash, the same man who glimpsed eternal truth fell back into ego. The keys did not erase the struggle. They demanded vigilance. Spiritual authority could be given, but it had to be exercised through constant surrender. History shows how often this lesson was forgotten. Religious institutions seized on the imagery of keys to justify dominance, control, and exclusion. But Jesus' language was not about locking doors, it was about opening them. The true bearer of keys is not a gatekeeper, but a guide. Not one who builds walls, but one who reveals passages. This symbolism reverberates through other traditions as well. In Jewish mysticism, the key represents access to hidden wisdom. In Islamic teaching, God is described as the one who holds the keys to the unseen. Even in modern geopolitics, the language of keys persists. Nations speak of key allies, key trade routes, key strategies. In every context, Keys signify access to knowledge, power, security. But unlike the world's keys, which protect privilege, Jesus' keys were meant to unlock universality. In fact, the modern world offers a striking parallel. Consider the digital age, where encryption keys protect sensitive information. Access is not given to all. It requires authorization. In the same way, spiritual keys are about readiness, not favoritism. They are entrusted to those who can wield them responsibly, without corruption. And like Peter, even the entrusted must remain vigilant against ego's infiltration. Perhaps the most powerful implication is this: the keys are not limited to Peter. Every person who awakens to the inner Christ, who perceives truth beyond illusion, receives them in some measure. Each revelation that dissolves the false self and connects us to eternal essence is itself a key. Each act of compassion that aligns human action with divine will is a key. Access is not monopoly, it is invitation. But here lies the paradox. The keys are universal, yet they are never cheap. They demand surrender, humility, and continuous transformation. Just as nuclear codes are entrusted only to those in highest command because of their destructive potential, so too spiritual authority carries risk. It can liberate or it can corrupt. History is littered with examples of both outcomes. In Peter, we see ourselves, capable of sublime revelation yet vulnerable to illusion, able to confess truth in one breath and betray it in the next. The kingdom's keys are not awarded for perfection, but for willingness. And willingness, though fragile, is the seed of transformation. The moment of Peter's confession reminds us of something vital. The kingdom is not distant, nor locked away. It is present, available, waiting. The doors stand open. But only those with eyes to see, only those who, like Peter, for one fleeting moment, step beyond tradition, ego, and fear, will recognize it. The key is not external, it is inward, and it is offered still to all who dare to see. From the beginning, Jesus described the kingdom not as a political empire nor as a geographic dominion, but as a reality hidden within each individual. The kingdom of God does not come with observation, he said, nor will they say, "See here," or "See there," for indeed, the kingdom of God is within you. These words dismantled the expectations of his time. The people longed for a Messiah who would drive out Rome and restore a national throne. Instead, Jesus spoke of a kingdom without borders, armies, or palaces, a kingdom of consciousness. This kingdom, unlike Rome, could not be taxed, conquered, or destroyed. It was a revolution invisible to Caesar, yet more enduring than any imperial campaign. The empire fell, the inner kingdom remained. And in this reality, Jesus introduced a radical concept: abundance. Not as accumulation of goods, but as fullness of life. I have come that they may have life, and have it abundantly. This was not a promise of wealth, but of liberation from fear, anxiety, and scarcity. Rome controlled the population by managing grain supply, threatening famine if taxes went unpaid. Jesus countered with an economy of trust. Consider the lilies of the field. Consider the birds of the air. They neither toil nor hoard, yet they are sustained. His message was clear. Abundance is not the product of fear-driven systems, but of alignment with the source. The miracle of the loaves and fishes captures this vividly. At first glance, it seems a supernatural display of multiplication. But beneath the surface lies a deeper revelation. Where there is gratitude and sharing, scarcity dissolves. In a world built on competition, he modeled cooperation. In a system where bread was weaponized, he demonstrated that the little, when trusted to God, becomes enough, even overflowing. Economists today might call this a shift from scarcity mindset to abundance mindset. Scarcity breeds hoarding, inequality, and war. Abundance fosters generosity, equity, and peace. The kingdom's economics were not numbers on a ledger, but states of consciousness. Those who trusted in divine provision discovered that life expanded, resources flowed, and fear lost its grip. This abundance was not limited to material goods. It included wisdom, compassion, and inner strength. Jesus promised, "Seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you." The logic was revolutionary. Prioritize inner order and external needs will align. This principle resonates with modern psychology, where studies show that security and well-being are less tied to wealth than to perception, gratitude, and community. Yet abundance also redefined wealth itself. "Do not store up treasures on earth, where moth and rust destroy and thieves break in and steal," he warned. Earthly accumulation was fragile. True wealth was eternal. Peace, love, truth, communion with God. Here Jesus clashed head-on with both empire and temple. Rome glorified, conquest and gold. Religious elites profited from tithes and temple taxes. Jesus stripped both systems of their foundation, declaring that real treasure could not be measured in coins. This message reverberates today. Nations measure success in GDP, markets, and consumption. Yet global crises, environmental collapse, social inequality, wars over resources reveal the illusion of scarcity within abundance. Jesus' teaching pierces this paradox. The planet has enough to sustain life, but fear, greed, and ego distort distribution. The kingdom's abundance is not utopian fantasy. It is a call to reorder human systems around trust, simplicity, and generosity. The imagery of seas in Palestine offers a striking metaphor. The Dead Sea receives water but never gives, and it is barren. The Sea of Galilee receives and gives, and it teems with life. So it is with the human heart. Hoarding suffocates, sharing multiplies. Abundance is dynamic, not static. It is a current that flows when trust opens the channel. Jesus' table fellowship embodied this principle. He ate with tax collectors, sinners, the poor, and the excluded. The banquet of the kingdom was not for the elite, but for all. This inclusivity shattered social boundaries and threatened hierarchies. Abundance in his vision was not privilege for a few, but inheritance for all. "The sun rises on the evil and the good," he said. "The rain falls on the just and the unjust." Divine. Generosity knows no borders. Perhaps the most radical aspect was his teaching on time. The ego lives in fear of tomorrow, enslaved by anxiety. The kingdom lives in the eternal present. Do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own. Here, abundance is not delayed. In some future paradise, it is available now. Scarcity exists only in the mind's projection. In the present, there is always enough. To live in this kingdom is to embrace simplicity, not poverty for its own sake, but detachment. The rich young ruler walked away sorrowful when told to sell his possessions, not because wealth was evil, but because attachment chained him. The narrow gate could not be entered with baggage. Abundance required freedom, not accumulation. For the modern world, obsessed with consumption and burdened by debt, this teaching is revolutionary. It challenges the engines of global capitalism, which thrive on scarcity and desire. It suggests that true prosperity lies not in endless growth, but in balance, generosity, and alignment with higher order. The abundance of the kingdom is not exclusive but universal. It is not achieved but revealed. It is not earned but inherited. And it is offered to all who shift perception from fear to trust, from ego to spirit. This abundance, inner, unshakable, eternal, was and remains the heartbeat of the kingdom Jesus proclaimed. Among the most haunting words spoken by Jesus are these: "Enter through the narrow gate. For wide is the gate, and broad is the road that leads to destruction, and many enter through it. But small is the gate, and narrow the road that leads to life, and only a few find it." This warning was not abstract. It was a diagnosis of human behavior across history. The wide path is easy, it promises comfort, consensus, and applause. The narrow path demands vigilance, courage, and detachment, and it is here at this crossroads that the fate of individuals and civilizations is determined. The wide gate is crowded because it asks nothing of us. It allows us to carry our baggage of pride, vanity, resentment, and fear. It accommodates inherited traditions, superficial desires, and mass illusions. It looks attractive because it offers shortcuts, but its end is destruction not as divine punishment, but as the natural consequence of a life enslaved by ego. Civilizations, too, have walked this wide path, and history shows the outcome. Collapse. The narrow gate, by contrast, is demanding. It cannot be passed through with heavy loads. To enter, one must shed what is non-essential: illusions, attachments, masks. This is not punishment but liberation. The narrow gate is not restrictive, it is purifying. It strips away what imprisons, so that the true self can pass into freedom. The story of the rich young man illustrates this perfectly. He desired eternal life, but could not part with his wealth. His wealth itself was not the obstacle. His attachment was. The narrow gate required detachment, and he turned away. Here lies the tragedy repeated in every age. People want the kingdom but resist its cost. They desire abundance while clinging to scarcity. They long for freedom but refuse to release their chains. The broad path seduces with conformity. It invites us to follow the crowd, to think as others think, to seek external approval. It offers popularity, but at the cost of authenticity. The narrow path, however, is lonely. It requires walking against the current, defying conventions, breaking inherited illusions. Jesus himself embodied this. He refused to conform to political or religious systems, and the result was rejection. Yet through rejection came revelation. The narrow gate also symbolizes simplicity. Children, he said, are closer to the kingdom because their hearts are unburdened. Theologians and philosophers build elaborate systems, but Jesus pointed to trust, purity, and humility. Complexity is the ego's defense. Simplicity is the spirit's clarity. The narrow gate is small because it does not accommodate excess-only essence. This teaching has profound modern relevance. In politics, the broad path is populism, easy promises, comforting illusions, mass appeal. The narrow path is principled leadership, costly, often unpopular, demanding sacrifice. In economics, the broad path is consumerism, endless growth, reckless exploitation. The narrow path is sustainability, living within limits, choosing long-term survival over short-term profit. In technology, the broad path is distraction, addiction, noise. The narrow path is discernment, intentional use, mindful silence, inner freedom. The message is clear. The gate is narrow, not because God is cruel, but because truth is uncompromising. One cannot carry illusions into reality. One cannot enter eternity while clinging to the temporal. The very things we cherish, pride, wealth, recognition, ideology, are too large to fit. They must be left behind. The paradox is striking. The narrow gate leads to infinite space. At first it feels like loss, restriction, sacrifice. But once passed, it opens into abundance, freedom, and peace. The wide gate feels expansive, but it leads into invisible prison. What seems like liberty becomes slavery. What seems like sacrifice becomes liberation. This paradox echoes in the struggles of every era. Nations that pursue expansion without restraint collapse under their weight. Individuals who chase pleasure without discipline destroy themselves. The wide path always ends in ruin, while the narrow path, though difficult, alone sustains life. And it is not a one-time choice. Jesus spoke of carrying the cross daily. The narrow gate is crossed not once but continuously. Each decision, each thought, each gesture is a new threshold. Every day, humans stand at two gates, one wide, one narrow. Each day, the choice returns. Many start the narrow path but abandon it when difficulty comes. They prefer ease, applause, conformity. But the kingdom is not won by shortcuts. It requires perseverance. Those who endure to the end will be saved. And so the mystery stands. Why do so few choose it? Because few are willing to pay the cost. The wide path disguises slavery as freedom. The narrow path disguises freedom as sacrifice. Only those with eyes to see discern the difference. Only those with courage to shed illusions step through. The narrow gate remains before us all. The question is not whether it exists, but whether we will choose to enter. As centuries passed, much of what Jesus revealed in silence to his closest disciples began to fade from public memory. What had been a living invitation to inner transformation was gradually reshaped into systems of external control. The radical message of the kingdom within a reality accessible to anyone, beyond temples and empires, was uncomfortable for authorities. And so, history records a slow but deliberate shift, from personal awakening to institutional obedience, from inner freedom to outer conformity. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries, Christian communities were multiplying across the Roman world. Each interpreted the Master's words in unique ways. Among them, the Gnostics stood out. They emphasized that salvation was not simply about believing doctrines, but about awakening the divine spark within. To them, Christ came not merely to forgive sins but to remind humanity of its forgotten origin. Knowledge gnosis was the key to liberation. But this vision posed a problem. If God's presence could be accessed directly within, what need was there for priestly authority, for elaborate rituals, for institutional mediation? It was a dangerous idea for those who sought to centralize power. As a result, Gnostic texts were condemned, banned, and in many cases destroyed. Yet Providence preserved some of them. In 1945, in Nag Hammadi, Egypt, a buried library of forgotten writings was unearthed. Among them the Gospel of Thomas, which recorded sayings of Jesus with stark clarity. The kingdom is inside you, and it is outside you. When you come to know yourselves, then you will be known, and you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father. Such statements cut directly to the heart of Jesus' teaching. The kingdom is not a distant prize, but an immediate reality, waiting for inner recognition. No empire could regulate it. No institution could monopolize it. It was universal, personal, and dangerously free. Mary Magdalene, too, emerges in these suppressed texts with striking authority. Far from the repentant sinner image later imposed, on her she appears as one who understood the hidden teaching more deeply than many of the male disciples. She received revelations others could not grasp. Yet jealousy and rivalry clouded her reception. Here we see an early tension, the battle between an inclusive inward kingdom and a rigid external hierarchy. Mary's role became minimized, her authority erased, and her legacy reduced. But her image in apocryphal texts remains a symbol of the hidden heritage, a message too radical for official tradition, but too powerful to vanish completely. Through the Middle Ages, this forgotten current resurfaced in the voices of mystics. Figures like Meister Eckhart, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, and Hildegard of Bingen proclaimed in their own ways that the divine was found not primarily in rituals or institutions, but in silence, in inner stillness, in direct union with God. Many of them were persecuted for heresy. Their crime? Declaring that the soul could unite with God without intermediaries, yet their writings endured, whispering the same truth Jesus had entrusted to the attentive. The kingdom is within. This pattern repeats throughout history. Whenever power structures solidify, the inner teaching becomes inconvenient. Systems thrive on control, but an awakened human being cannot be controlled. For this reason, institutions softened the radical edge of Jesus' words, turning them into moral codes, political order, or distant promises. And yet, like fire beneath ashes, the hidden teaching never disappeared. It passed quietly from heart, community to community, generation to generation. In our own era, the rediscovery of lost gospels and ancient manuscripts is more than archaeology. It is fulfillment of Jesus' own words. Nothing is hidden that will not be disclosed. What was once buried now resurfaces, challenging us to reconsider what was lost. The forgotten heritage reminds us that truth cannot be silenced forever. Even suppressed, it waits, even distorted, it survives. And perhaps this is the most unsettling part of the story. If the kingdom is truly within, then no institution, political, religious, or cultural, has final authority over it. Every human being carries the doorway. Every human being is invited to awaken. For rulers of any age, this is a dangerous idea. For seekers of any age, it is liberation. Even within the canonical Gospels that survived the political filters of history, the heartbeat of the inner kingdom still pulses. It has always been there, hidden in plain sight, waiting for attentive readers to notice. The parables themselves still whisper of states of consciousness. The Sermon on the Mount still calls for a radical inversion of values. The teachings about prayer in secret, about childlike trust, about loving even one's enemies, all of them point inward, beyond ritual, beyond system, beyond empire. But tradition, shaped by centuries of institutions, often emphasized the external. Miracles became spectacles. Heaven was postponed into a distant afterlife. The radical immediacy of Jesus' message was softened into obedience to rules and rituals. Yet the forgotten heritage lies not in alternative scriptures alone, but within, the very text recognized by every Christian community. It is hidden in the pauses, in the silences, in the words that still resist domestication. History shows us why this shift occurred. Empires need order. Religions that ally with empire adapt to serve it. By the 4th century, when Christianity was legalized and then absorbed into Roman state power, the revolutionary spirit of the kingdom had to be tamed. A movement that began with fishermen and tax collectors proclaiming inner freedom was reshaped into a system that legitimized emperors and bishops. The sword replaced the parable, creed replaced silence. Yet even then, individuals and small communities remembered the deeper call. The mystics, both sanctioned and persecuted, kept that call alive. They wrote of experiences that could not be explained by dogma, moments of union, visions of light, overwhelming love. Their language echoes the very words of Jesus. The kingdom is not out there, it is here. Not tomorrow, but now. Not in books alone, but in awakened hearts. The forgotten heritage also resonates beyond Christianity. In Islam, the Sufi poets like Rumi and Hafiz declared that God was closer than the breath. In Buddhism, monks spoke of nirvana as already present, accessible when illusion drops away. In Hindu tradition, sages proclaimed the Atman, the divine self within. What Jesus taught then was not an isolated doctrine, but part of a universal thread. Humanity's oldest truth, often resisted by systems, always rediscovered by seekers. This has profound implications for our modern world. In an age of noise, political propaganda, digital distraction, economic anxiety, the call to silence is radical. To withdraw, to listen, to awaken within, is to resist systems that thrive on fear and manipulation. An awakened individual is harder to control, harder to deceive, harder to enslave. Perhaps this is why the kingdom within was hidden, even suppressed, and perhaps this is why rediscovering it now is more urgent than ever. The forgotten heritage is not merely a matter of recovering ancient texts or honoring mystical traditions. It is about memory, remembering what we already are. Jesus' words return like an echo. You are the light of the world. This was not flattery, it was ontology. Human beings, created in the image of the divine, already carry the light. The tragedy is not that the light is absent, but that it is covered by layers of illusion, fear, and ego. Every generation faces the same temptation, to trade the living kingdom for external security, to replace awakening with ritual, to prefer control over freedom. Yet the heritage never dies. Even in the darkest centuries of religious authoritarianism, there were always those who heard the whisper, "The kingdom is within." Their voices may have been silenced, but their words live on, carried through hidden manuscripts, mystical poetry, and even in the margins of official scripture. Today, in a world fractured by ideological wars, where institutions again struggle for authority and individuals search desperately for meaning, the forgotten heritage rises once more. It insists that salvation is not monopoly, but birthright. That truth is not a distant doctrine, but an immediate reality, that the kingdom is not waiting for us to arrive in the future, but waiting for us to awaken in the present. And so the invitation remains, not from history, not from institutions, but from within. Each human being carries the forgotten key. Each heart, if it dares to quiet itself, can rediscover the flame. The forgotten heritage is not lost. It is hidden in us, waiting for remembrance. As the narrative draws closer to its conclusion, we return to the essence of Jesus' teaching. The kingdom is not distant, not delayed, not dependent on institutions or rulers. It is alive now, accessible in the silence of every awakened heart. His message was never meant to be confined to history. It was always alive, always urgent, always present. I am with you always, even unto the end of the age. These words, recorded at the end of the Gospel of Matthew, are not just a farewell, blessing. They are a declaration that the presence of Christ transcends time. He is not merely a figure of the past, but a living reality encountered inwardly. He speaks still, not in the noise of politics or the rituals of empire, but in the quiet corners of the soul. The path of return is clear. Silence, renewal, vigilance, love. Silence, the gateway to perception, where the ego falls away and the spirit listens. Renewal, the continual metanoia that reshapes perception, dismantles illusions, and awakens the true self. Vigilance, the daily choice to walk the narrow gate, to resist the easy lies of the ego and the crowd, and love the language of the kingdom, where every boundary dissolves and every being is seen as kin. This return is not theoretical. It has real consequences for human life, for communities, and even for civilizations. A person who returns to the kingdom lives without fear of scarcity, without addiction to recognition, without slavery to systems. Such a person becomes resilient, free, and compassionate. A society shaped by this awareness would measure success, not by wealth or conquest, but by peace, justice, and unity. In modern geopolitical terms, this is nothing less than revolutionary. Imagine a world where nations measured abundance not by GDP, but by the well-being of citizens, where leaders sought greatness not in domination but in service, where cooperation replaced competition as the organizing principle of human life. Jesus' kingdom, if truly embraced, undermines every empire that thrives on fear, hierarchy, and exploitation. That is why his message was, and remains, so subversive. The forgotten heritage is therefore not a relic of the past, but a map for the future. The rediscovery of suppressed gospels, the testimony of mystics, the whispers of inner experience all converge to remind us of what was nearly lost. The kingdom is here, now, within. To awaken to it is to step into the eternal present where life overflows, love reigns, and fear dissolves. Jesus' final invitation remains unchanged. Follow me. But to follow him is not merely to imitate historical footsteps. It is to embody his consciousness, his surrender, his courage, his love. It is to let Christ live in us, as Paul declared, until the ego falls silent and the Spirit speaks. This following is not ritual but transformation, not dogma but awakening. The challenge is personal. Each of us must decide whether to continue along the wide road of illusions or to risk the narrow gate of truth. Each moment is another crossing. Each silence is another opportunity. The kingdom does not wait in the future, it calls in the present. And the present, however fragile, is infinite. The truth entrusted to the intimate few, suppressed by institutions and forgotten by many, still stands. It was never fully silenced. It cannot be destroyed. Like a seed buried deep in soil, it waits, and when hearts awaken, it blooms. The invitation is before us, to return, to awaken, to live. For the kingdom is not there, it is here. It is not then, it is now. It is not outside, it is within, and it waits for all who have ears to hear. As we reflect on this journey, a striking realization emerges. The struggle to awaken to the inner kingdom is not only a spiritual challenge, but also a geopolitical one. For centuries, rulers, empires, and institutions have feared the implications of Jesus' words because they undermine external control. If people discover that divine authority resides within them, they become difficult to govern by fear, manipulation, or coercion. The Roman Empire sensed this threat. Later, religious and political systems sensed it too. That is why the message was softened, institutionalized, and at times buried. But history shows that truth has a way of resurfacing. Whenever power seeks to suppress it, it reappears through mystics, poets, reformers, and ordinary seekers who dare to listen. Like water, flowing underground, it cannot be contained forever. It erupts when the time is ripe. In this sense, Jesus' teaching has proven more enduring than any empire, more resilient than any institution, and more transformative than any political revolution. Even today, in an era defined by globalization, surveillance, and ideological conflict, the kingdom within remains the most disruptive idea of all. Governments spend billions on propaganda to shape perception. Corporations spend trillions to cultivate desire and dependency. Media saturates the mind with distraction. Yet the moment a person awakens inwardly, these forces lose much of their grip. A human being who lives from the kingdom is not easily manipulated. Their peace is not for sale. Their freedom cannot be purchased. Their allegiance belongs not to empire but to truth. This is why the message matters now more than ever. Humanity stands at a crossroads. Environmental collapse threatens survival, economic inequality fuels unrest, and technological revolutions reshape identity itself. Politicians promise salvation through policy, technocrats through innovation, corporations through consumption, but without inner transformation, these promises remain fragile. External reform without internal renewal repeats the same cycles of collapse. Jesus' call to metanoia, to change perception at its root, may be the very key to navigating the crises of the 21st century. Consider the geopolitical dimension. Empires fall not only because of external invasion, but because of internal decay, corruption, arrogance, blindness to truth. Rome fell this way. The Soviet Union collapsed this way. Every great power eventually meets this fate. Jesus' warning, "What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and yet lose his soul?" applies as much to nations as to individuals. What does it profit a superpower to dominate markets and armies if it destroys the planet that sustains it? What does it profit an economy to multiply wealth if it multiplies despair? The wide road beckons nations as much as people, and the cost of choosing it is destruction. The alternative, the narrow gate, remains difficult but possible. For individuals, it requires shedding ego. For societies, it demands humility, justice, and sustainability. It calls for a reordering of priorities, from profit to people, from conquest to cooperation, from fear to trust. This is not naive idealism. It is survival. Without such a shift, humanity risks repeating the pattern of every fallen empire, only this time on a planetary scale. The kingdom within is not escapism. It does not remove us from history but empowers us to engage it differently. Those who awaken do not abandon the world. They transform it. They become salt, light, and leaven quiet forces that preserve, illuminate, and expand. This was always Jesus' vision, not an empire to rival Rome, but a movement of awakened individuals whose inner transformation spills outward into society. And so the invitation remains not only spiritual, but civilizational. The narrow gate is before humanity as a whole. Will we continue down the broad path of greed, fear, and illusion, or will we awaken to the inner kingdom and chart a new course? The answer will shape not only personal destiny, but the future of civilization itself. The legacy of Jesus' teaching confronts us with a paradox. It is both deeply personal and profoundly collective. On the one hand, he spoke to the heart, calling each individual to awaken, to repent, to be reborn. On the other, his vision carried unmistakable social consequences, a reordering of values that, if embraced broadly, would transform communities, economies, and nations. The personal and the political cannot be separated. When enough individuals awaken, societies change. When societies change, the trajectory of history itself shifts. Consider the Sermon on the Mount, often regarded as the manifesto of the kingdom. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. These are not sentimental platitudes. They are subversive redefinitions of power. In a world where Rome glorified wealth, violence, and domination, Jesus declared the opposite. That true strength lies in humility, in mercy, in peace. This inversion was radical then, and remains radical now. It undermines every empire built on pride. The same sermon included his famous command, "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, pray for those who persecute you." Modern geopolitics runs on the logic of retaliation, attack for attack, sanction for sanction, war for war. Yet Jesus articulated a higher law: break the cycle of vengeance by refusing to mirror it. This is not weakness, but strength. To refuse, hatred is to deny the enemy power over one's inner life. In psychological terms, it is freedom from reactive living. In political terms, it is the foundation of peace. History offers examples of how this teaching, when embraced, alters entire nations. Gandhi, inspired by Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, developed nonviolent resistance that dismantled colonial power. Martin Luther King Jr. likewise declared that love and nonviolence were not only moral imperatives, but political strategies capable of transforming society. Both leaders faced ridicule, opposition, and even death, but their impact proved that the kingdom's principles are not utopian dreams. They are practical forces that reshape history. At the heart of these movements is the recognition that external change begins with inner change. Jesus did not offer a blueprint for political systems. He offered a blueprint for human transformation. From that soil, just systems can grow. Without that soil, even the best designed systems rot. The metaphors he used, salt, light, leaven, capture this perfectly. Salt preserves, but only in small amounts. Light illuminates, but even a single flame can dispel vast darkness. Leaven is hidden, yet it transforms the whole loaf. These images describe influence that is subtle, quiet, yet unstoppable. The kingdom advances not through conquest, but through contagion of consciousness. In our modern world, shaped by global capitalism and digital media, the temptation is to believe only large-scale forces matter: multinational corporations, superpower alliances, technological revolutions. Yet Jesus reminds us that transformation begins invisibly, within. A single awakened person alters the dynamics of a family. A small community of integrity challenges corruption in a city. A movement rooted in love can destabilize empires. The hidden power of the kingdom remains history's most underestimated force. This is why the kingdom is often missed. It does not arrive with spectacle. It does not demand headlines. It appears in small acts of mercy, in forgiveness, in hidden resilience. It arrives in the quiet refusal to hate, in the silent endurance of injustice without retaliation, in the daily choice to walk the narrow path. Such acts rarely make the news, but they are the true revolutions, and this is precisely what makes the kingdom indestructible. Empires collapse, institutions decay, ideologies fade, but an awakened heart endures. A single act of love ripples across generations. The kingdom within cannot be conquered because it does not depend on external power. It survives prisons, persecutions, and even crucifixion. The invitation then is clear: to live as citizens of this kingdom now, to embody its values in personal life and public life, to let inner transformation spill into action, not as ideology, but as authenticity. Jesus did not offer escape from the world. He offered a way to inhabit it differently. That difference, subtle yet radical, is what the forgotten heritage calls us to rediscover. The story of Jesus cannot end with crucifixion alone, for the cross was not defeat but revelation. In that moment of apparent loss, when empire believed it had silenced him and religious authorities thought they had preserved their control, the true nature of the kingdom was unveiled. The cross revealed the final illusion of the ego, its belief that power, violence, and fear can conquer truth. But truth, once awakened, cannot be killed. Resurrection was more than an event. It was the vindication of everything he taught. Rome could crucify a body, but it could not crucify the kingdom within. Religious leaders could condemn him, but they could not silence the awakening he ignited. The resurrection declared, in the most dramatic way possible, that life is stronger than death, love stronger than hate, and truth stronger than illusion. It was the ultimate confirmation that the kingdom is eternal, beyond the reach of empire and institution. For the disciples, this moment transformed despair into courage. Those who had fled in fear suddenly became bold, proclaiming the message openly in the very city where their master had been executed. Something had shifted. They no longer lived for survival. They lived from resurrection. The ego, with its fear of death, had lost its hold, and this fearlessness became the most powerful weapon of the early movement. Empires can control populations through fear, but they cannot control those who no longer fear death. The resurrection also carried profound symbolism. It was not just the return of one man from the grave, it was the unveiling of a new humanity. Paul would later call Christ the first fruits of those who will rise, meaning that resurrection was not anomaly, but archetype. What happened to Jesus was the destiny of all who awaken, to pass beyond the illusions of the false self into the eternal reality of the true self. Death, then, is not an end, but a passage. This message has echoed throughout history, inspiring countless movements of hope. Enslaved peoples in every age clung to it as proof that oppression was not final. Dissidents under totalitarian regimes drew strength from it, convinced that truth cannot be permanently buried. Even today, in societies fractured by violence and despair, the resurrection remains a beacon, reminding us that even in the darkest night, dawn breaks. In geopolitical terms, resurrection undermines the psychology of empire. Empires rule by fear, fear of punishment, fear of poverty, fear of death. The resurrection proclaims the futility of such fear. If death itself is conquered, then no threat remains. An awakened people cannot be enslaved by terror. This explains why Rome and every empire since found the message so dangerous. Resurrection is not only theology, it is resistance. But like every truth, resurrection has been distorted. Institutions often framed it as a distant promise, a ticket to heaven if one obeys external rules. Yet the original proclamation was immediate. Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, he is risen. Resurrection was not a distant hope, but a present reality. It meant that even now life overcomes death, truth overcomes lies, and spirit overcomes fear. The invitation was not simply to believe in resurrection, but to live from it fearlessly, generously, abundantly. Living from resurrection means embodying its power in daily life. It means refusing to let fear dictate choices. It means daring to love in a world addicted to hate, daring to forgive in a culture built on vengeance, daring to hope when despair feels inevitable. Resurrection is not merely an article of faith, it is a way of being. The disciples carried this way into the world. They were ordinary men and women, but resurrection made them extraordinary. Their courage defied emperors, their love dismantled barriers, their hope outlasted persecution. They did not build an empire, they ignited a movement. And though institutions later co-opted and distorted it, the essence of resurrection remains untamed. To embrace resurrection is to embrace transformation not only of the self, but of the world. It is to live with the conviction that injustice is temporary, that violence is fragile, that even death cannot cancel truth. It is to stand in the ruins of empire and declare that love still lives. The resurrection was not the end of the story, but the beginning of a new era, one that carried both promise and peril. The promise was clear. The kingdom could not be silenced, not by crucifixion, not by empire, not by death itself. But the peril lay in how that message would be carried, interpreted, and institutionalized. Would it remain a living invitation to inner awakening, or would it harden into dogma, wielded as a tool of control? In the earliest communities, we see both possibilities unfolding. On one hand, the disciples gathered in simplicity, breaking bread, sharing resources, living as though the kingdom were already present. Acts records that no one claimed that any of their possessions was their own, but they shared everything they had. This was a radical economy of trust, an embodiment of the abundance Jesus taught. They lived not by scarcity, but by generosity. It was revolutionary, a direct challenge to Roman economic exploitation. On the other hand, pressures soon mounted. Persecution by empire forced believers into secrecy. Rival teachings created divisions. Human ambition, always lurking, began to infiltrate. What began as a movement of the spirit risked becoming a structure of power. By the 4th century, when Constantine embraced Christianity, the movement that had defied Rome suddenly became aligned with it. The cross, once a symbol of resistance to empire, was painted on imperial banners. The kingdom within was overshadowed by the kingdom without. This tension has never disappeared. Throughout history, the church has oscillated between awakening and conformity, between prophecy and power. Mystics, reformers, and visionaries kept pointing back to the inner kingdom, while institutions often emphasized external obedience. Both currents remain alive today, pulling in opposite directions, one toward liberation, the other toward control. Yet even in its most corrupted moments, the flame of the original teaching never fully died. The mystics of the Middle Ages, the reformers of the Renaissance, the revivalists of modern times all rediscovered fragments of the forgotten heritage. They insisted that faith was not simply assent to doctrines but an encounter with the living Christ within. They were often marginalized, sometimes silenced, but their voices endured. In our time, the tension surfaces again. Institutional religion struggles with declining trust, scandals, and irrelevance while millions of people search for spirituality outside its walls. Yet this crisis may be opportunity. It may signal a return to the essence, the kingdom within. If institutions cannot hold it, individuals must rediscover it. And if enough individuals awaken, communities can be reborn. The resurrection, then, is not only a past event but an ongoing invitation. It calls each generation to discern, will we align with empire or with kingdom? Will we cling to external power or embrace inner transformation? The choice is not abstract. It plays out in politics, economics, and culture. It determines whether societies spiral into collapse or rise into renewal. In global perspective, the resurrection is a challenge to every system that thrives on fear. It declares that even the worst violence cannot erase truth. It invites humanity to live without fear of death and therefore without slavery to empire. This freedom is dangerous to those who rule by manipulation, but it is life to those who embrace it. To live resurrection is to walk as witnesses not only of what happened to Jesus, but of what happens in every awakened life. It means becoming, as Paul wrote, a new creation. It means refusing to be conformed to the world's illusions and daring instead to embody a different reality. Such lives become living evidence that the kingdom is real, here, now. And so the forgotten heritage continues, not as relic, not as ideology, but as living truth. The resurrection proclaims that history itself is not bound by despair. It reminds us that every ending can become a beginning, every death a doorway, every tomb a womb of new creation. As we arrive at the closing movement of this long journey, the message stands illuminated with even greater clarity. The kingdom of God was never about institutions, rituals, or distant heavens. It was always about awakening here now within. Everything Jesus taught, every parable he whispered, every silence he kept, every confrontation he endured, pointed toward this truth. The greatest revolution is not fought with armies or decrees, but with perception. The tragedy of history is that this revolution was often misunderstood or deliberately suppressed. Political power sought to domesticate it, religious authorities sought to monopolize it, and society sought to dilute it into manageable rituals, yet the flame could not be extinguished. From hidden gospels to mystical writings, from persecuted reformers to modern seekers, the same truth has resurfaced again and again. The kingdom is within you. What does this mean for us now, in an age defined by noise, fear, and fracture? It means that the invitation is more urgent than ever. We live in a time when empires are shifting, when economic systems strain under inequality, when technology threatens to overwhelm identity itself. The temptation is to search for salvation, outside in leaders and ideologies and systems. But history warns us, without inner transformation, external reform crumbles. Without awakened individuals, societies repeat the same cycles of rise and fall. The invitation of Jesus, radical, disruptive, liberating, is to begin within. To silence the ego, to shed illusions, to walk the narrow gate, to live in abundance, to embrace love even for enemies, to embody resurrection in daily life. This is not passivity. It is the most subversive act possible. For a person who lives from the kingdom cannot be enslaved by fear, manipulated by propaganda, or consumed by greed. Such a person becomes light in darkness, leaven in the loaf, salt that preserves what is good. Imagine a world shaped by such awakening. Nations would measure prosperity not by the volume of their weapons, but by the well-being of their people. Economies would prioritize sustainability over endless exploitation. Technology would serve humanity rather than enslave it. Politics would seek cooperation instead of division. This vision is not fantasy. It is the logical extension of the kingdom's principles lived out by enough awakened individuals. And yet the kingdom does not wait for mass movements to begin. It begins in each heart willing to hear. It is planted like a seed, hidden, small, but destined to grow. The responsibility is personal. He who has ears, let him hear. The question is not whether the kingdom exists, but whether we will awaken to it. This is the forgotten heritage, not a distant heaven to be earned, but a present reality to be realized. Not a monopoly of priests or rulers, but a birthright of every human soul. Not a relic of history, but a living truth that confronts us still. And so the words of Jesus echo across centuries into our own. The kingdom of God is within you. They are both comfort and challenge, both invitation and demand. Comfort because they remind us we are never far from God, the door is always within reach. Challenge because they call us to radical transformation, a change of mind, a rebirth of spirit, a surrender of ego. The choice remains: the wide road of illusion or the narrow gate of truth, the false self or the true self, empire or kingdom. Each moment is another decision, another chance to awaken. The story is not finished. It continues in us. For the kingdom has no capital, no army, no borders. Its throne is the awakened heart. Its law is love. Its power is truth. Its destiny is eternal. The final invitation is simple, yet infinite. Awaken, return, live.